the real reason behind the Iraqi war. In 2003, United States, United Kingdom, and a few other allies invaded Iraq and overthrew its government. This event was a huge turning point in the 21st century, and yet many people don't understand why the West would do such a thing. As a kid, I remember watching the news unfold in my living room with my parents. We were stunned at what we were seeing. I was 9 years old at the time, and I remember thinking, why are they attacking this poor country? Why did they have to do this? And when I went to school the next day, I was even more confused because all my teachers were talking about was how Saddam Hussein was a terrible dictator who oppressed his own people and that the United States was freeing them from his regime. But as the weeks and months went by, it became clear that there was something else going on. Because if you actually look into the historical context of the war, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Saddam Hussein wasn't exactly the best leader of Iraq. He came into power during the Iran-Iraq War. And although he did a pretty good job of keeping Iraq together after the war, his regime was undoubtedly cruel and oppressive. However, he was also a staunch ally of the West against the Soviet Union. In fact, it was thanks to Saddam Hussein that we have pictures of the inside of an Iraqi nuclear reactor. That's because in the late 1980s, the United Nations sent inspectors to Iraq to verify that Saddam Hussein had indeed stopped developing nuclear weapons. But he let them in only under the condition that they install cameras everywhere so that he could show them around. So in a way, Saddam Hussein helped us beat the Soviets and he helped us keep tabs on his own nuclear program. However, sometime in the mid-1990s, Saddam Hussein started developing nuclear weapons again and the UN tried to stop him once more, but this time he didn't cooperate. So in 1991, the United States led a military operation called Desert Storm to push Iraq out of Kuwait. During the conflict, the U.S. dropped over 88,000 bombs on Iraq, killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers and left hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians dead. And ever since then, the US has kept troops in the Middle East to prevent Iraq from becoming a threat once more. But in the early 2000s, George Bush declared a new policy called the Bush Doctrine, which stated that the United States has the right to invade any nation that possesses or might acquire weapons of mass destruction. At the same time, Bush started receiving intelligence reports from the CIA that claimed Saddam Hussein had recently purchased mobile biological weapons labs, which meant he was likely developing biological weapons. On top of that, in October 2002, Bush gave an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein demanding that he disarm or face the consequences. And just like that, tensions started rising between Iraq and the West. So finally, on March 2003, the United States, the United Kingdom, and a few other nations invaded Iraq. Within 2 weeks, they managed to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime and put an end to his dictatorship. But that wasn't the end of the story. You see, before the war began, Britain and the United States had already made plans for what would happen after Saddam Hussein fell. They created the Iraq Interim Authority and appointed Paul Bremer as its administrator. His task was to completely restructure Iraq's government and society according to Western standards. For instance, he disbanded the Iraqi army, abolished the old laws, and established democracy. And although on paper this sounds like a great idea, in reality it was an absolute disaster. You see, the problem with imposing democracy in the Middle East is that democracy requires educated citizens. But in Iraq, only 45% of the population was literate. Most Iraqis couldn't even vote if their lives depended on it. And on top of that, Iraq was still a very tribal society. Before Saddam Hussein came to power, Iraqis used to fight each other based on religious and ethnic differences. Saddam Hussein ended most of that by oppressing everyone equally, but by taking him out of the equation, these differences resurfaced once more, leading to full-scale civil war. And that's not even the worst part. You see, Iraq is located in the center of the Fertile Crescent, one of the most important regions in the history of mankind. It's here where farming first emerged. It's here where the wheel and the plow were invented. And it's here where some of the oldest civilizations in the world thrived. To this day, Iraq is one of the most important countries in the region because it controls the oil pipelines that stretch across the Persian Gulf. That's why whoever controls Iraq controls the oil supply of the entire Middle East. That's why when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States felt threatened and intervened in the conflict. And that's also why when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States asked Saddam Hussein for help to stabilize the region. But with the rise of radical Islamism in the Middle East, controlling Iraq became a much bigger challenge. Since September 11th, the fear of terrorism has played a huge role in the politics of the region. And by taking down Saddam Hussein, the United States hoped to replace his secular regime with a government that shared the same values as the West. But things didn't turn out as planned. Instead of stabilizing the region, they created a power vacuum that allowed ISIS to take over. And instead of fighting against terrorists, they simply became one of the biggest terrorist organizations in the world. The thing is, the whole premise of the war was based on lies. According to the British government, Saddam Hussein was directly involved in the September 11th attacks. But investigations later proved that this wasn't true. Bush also claimed that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, but those never materialized either. And lastly, Bush said that Saddam Hussein was planning to invade Kuwait, but this claim was completely fabricated. The craziest part of it all is that even though the public knew the war was based on lies, they supported it anyway. When Bush announced the war to the American people, 60% of the population supported it, and only 13% were against it. And even though 60% is a majority, it doesn't tell the whole story because many Americans supported the war for completely different reasons than the ones given by Bush. For instance, polls taken at the time showed that 57% of Americans believed that the war would help prevent another terrorist attack. Another 36% thought it was necessary to remove Saddam Hussein from power. And only 25% supported the war because of what Bush had told them regarding weapons of mass destruction. So ultimately, the war was fought for three major reasons. 57% of the population wanted to prevent another terrorist attack, 36% wanted to remove Saddam Hussein from power, and 25% supported the war because of weapons of mass destruction. Of course, this data isn't 100% accurate because many Americans probably agreed with multiple answers. But regardless, you get the idea. Many Americans didn't care whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction or not. All they cared about was removing Saddam Hussein from power. And honestly, I can't blame them. The man was a ruthless dictator and he oppressed his own people for decades. In fact, when the United States overthrew his regime, many Iraqis celebrated in the streets. But what most Americans failed to realize was that Saddam Hussein wasn't really the problem. You see, Saddam Hussein came into power in the middle of a bloody war with Iran. And even though he won the conflict, his country was devastated. Millions of people had died and the infrastructure was completely destroyed. Not to mention that the United States had just imposed economic sanctions on Iraq, meaning that millions of people were facing food shortages. So when Saddam Hussein took power, he needed to find a way to stabilize the country and quickly. And given the circumstances, his only option was oppression. If he didn't crack down on rebel groups, they would tear the country apart. And if he didn't feed his population, they would starve to death. And unfortunately, neither the West nor the international community cared about any of this. The only thing they saw was a ruthless dictator who oppressed his people and wouldn't hesitate to use weapons of mass destruction against them. The thing is, Saddam Hussein wasn't perfect by any means, but he wasn't a monster either. In fact, when he came to power, he lifted economic sanctions and ended food shortages. He also built schools and hospitals all across the country and invested heavily in infrastructure projects. Sadly, he paid for all of this by taking away the freedom of his people. But given the situation he was in, that's probably what he felt he had to do. And ultimately, that's the real reason why the West invaded Iraq. They removed a brutal dictator from power and replaced him with a government that shared the same values as the West. But they failed to consider the long-term effects of their actions. The war destabilized the entire Middle East, created the largest refugee crisis in modern history, and paved the way for ISIS to take over. Ultimately, the only ones who truly benefited from the war were the oil companies. And the more instability the region faces, the more money they make. That is why it was a big win for them when ISIS took over and a civil war broke out once more. Thanks for watching.